Okay, I think we have a few more people trickling in, but probably have a critical mass. Hi, and thank you for joining today's workshop. I'm Sean Spivey, Senior Counsel and Chief of Staff of the FCC's Broadband Data Task Force. As most of you participating today know well, the new Broadband Data Collection Program will collect mobile broadband service availability throughout the country, along with fixed availability data. These new data will be subject to review by governmental entities, individual consumers, and other third parties, as well as verification by the FCC. The broadband maps the FCC will create from these new data will play a critical role in the efforts of federal, state, and tribal governments to ensure that essential broadband services are made available throughout the United States, and that broadband infrastructure funding is carefully targeted to the areas most in need. Today's workshop is the fourth and final segment in a series we have hosted this month, and is focused on how to use the BDC system and some of the most common error codes you may encounter. If you missed our first three workshops on the broadband service location fabric and how to submit fixed and mobile availability data into the BDC system, you can find those recordings online at fcc.gov/broadbanddata/resources, and by clicking on the Education tab on that page. We'll begin today's workshop with a few short presentations on common data specification pitfalls, some of the most common error messages you may encounter in the system and how to resolve them, expected processing times for uploading and processing your data files, and finally, some suggestions for how to navigate the BDC system. But we also want to make sure we hear from you, so we've reserved some time for questions after the presentations. Please email your questions to bdcwebinar@fcc.gov or utilize the Q&A function in the Zoom platform. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as time allows. If we are unable to answer a specific question today, you may submit your question via the FCC's online Bdc Help Center at fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. You can find additional information and resources in the Bdc Help Center, as well as a detailed user guide for the BDC system. The website will be regularly updated with additional resources and FAQs, and I would encourage you to visit the website often throughout this process. We appreciate you taking the time to participate in this workshop and hope that it will be helpful as you prepare to submit data in the inaugural BDC filing window, which opened on June 30th and will close on September 1st, which is now only 9 days away. With that, let's start our first presentation. I'm going to now turn it over to Jonathan McCormick, Deputy Director of the FCC's Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, an attorney in the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the System Development Lead for the new BDC system. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Sean. Apologies. This is also going to be another sort of technical deep dive, but hopefully this will help people resolve some of the issues that we've encountered along the way. So I'm going to start mostly talking about the data spec pitfalls and issues that users and filers in the system have commonly encountered when trying to format their data and get it ready for submission in the BDC so that it gets accepted and not returned as invalid data. Starting with the availability data, specifically the fixed broadband location list data. So these are the CSV tabular data that are submitted by fixed providers reporting their fixed services. And these CSV files have a requirement that there is a header in them. So some of the files for subscription data, as I'll discuss later, headers are optional, though always encouraged. In this case, the data spec requires that the headers of these fixed broadband location lists are there and correct, as well as that the file otherwise conforms to the requirements and structure of the data spec. Filers should first ensure that they have access to the broadband serviceable location fabric made available by the FCC's vendor cost quest, so that they can match up the locations to which service is or may be provided. And if you don't have access to the fabric, there's a whole section on that, I think maybe even subject of an earlier tutorial and webinar, but you should get access to that if that's what you want to do to submit this type of data. Alternatively, as I'll discuss in a moment, you can also submit Polygon coverage map data if that's not how you want to go about doing it. But specifically for the fixed broadband location list data, you need to actually identify the locations in the fabric to which you are providing service. In that case, there's a column called location_ID. And any values that a filer includes in that location ID field will be compared against the fabric database that we have, and must match an existing location, or else the system will raise a validation error. Please note that the active fabric data set, which is available from our vendor, includes some locations that are broadband serviceable locations, BSLs, and some that are not BSLs, for example, schools, libraries, or other community anchor institutions. So when you are generating your data or you're uploading your data, you must make sure to take care to filter out any location ID to which you may provide service or maybe be able to provide service where there's a BSL flag of false. If the BSL flag is false, then that location ID cannot show up in your fixed broadband location list data, or else it will raise a validation error and the system will reject the file. So that has been a very common issue that people have had. So please, please, please be careful when you are doing this matching and before you upload your data, that the location IDs that you're reporting, in fact, in the broadband serviceable location fabric data, have a BSL flag of true, otherwise it will be rejected. Turning next to the fixed coverage maps, as I said before, if you don't want to do the address matching or location matching for the locations, you can report your fixed broadband service in GIS Polygon data. There's several different supported formats, Esri shapefile, Esri file geodatabase, geopackage, and geojson. All of those are supported for these types of data. They, again, must conform to the structure and requirements of the data specification, which are very similar to what is in the fixed broadband location list data with slightly different names of the column headers, except that there's no location ID because you're actually giving us the footprint. And so we'll actually do the matching with the underlying broadband fabric locations. Fixed service providers that are submitting this type of data must not exceed certain maximum buffer distances around their aggregation points when you're reporting your fixed availability. And please refer to the data specifications for the specific maximum buffer distances because they differ by technology. Common across both the fixed broadband location list data and the fixed broadband coverage map data more generally. You can submit either fixed broadband location list data or fixed broadband coverage map data. You can't submit both the CSV and the GIS data for a single biannual submission. You must choose one or the other. And for providers that are submitting their data, there's a provider ID, provider_ID column that service providers are actually not required to give us. It exists in the file for the government and third-party entities if they are reporting verified fixed broadband availability data. They need to identify the service provider, but for service providers themselves, we know who you are, so you can leave that either null, which is blank, or you can enter a number such as 1, and the system will just ignore that field and will populate it with your actual ID when everything is being processed. The maximum advertised download speed and maximum advertised upload speed values, these should be reported as whole numbers representing the maximum data speeds that are advertised for the service. And if the max data speeds are less than 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload, filers should report either 10 and 1 for services that are less than 25.3 but are at least 10 and 1, or 0 and 0 for speeds that are at least 200 kilobits per second download and 200 kilobits per second upload, but are less than that 10-1 combined value. So moving on to other types of availability data, the mobile coverage maps. Again, there's there's no CSV file that a mobile provider can upload. They have to upload the coverage maps, the broadband broadband availability in a Polygon GIS data format. Again, Esri shapefile, Esri file geodatabase, geojson, geopackage, all 4 of those are supported. Again, service providers do not need to report actually any value for that provider underscore ID or provider ID field. They can leave it blank or enter a number such as 1. For the min down and min up values, these represent the minimum expected upload speeds and minimum expected download speeds. And these actually just must match certain standardized parameters. So in the case of 3G technology, that's 0.2 and 0.05 for 200 kilobits per second download and 50 kilobits per second upload. For 4G technology of 400, it needs to be 5 and 1. For 5G, there's actually 2 different speeds that are reported. So you can report either or both of the 7 megabits per second download, 1 megabit per second uploads, 7 and 1, or 35 and 3. Any other values that you report for speeds in the mobile file will actually be rejected by the system. Additionally, as I mentioned also in a previous webinar, mobile broadband polygons may not overlap with each other, where the technology and speed data attribute values are the same. So, your 3G and your 4G and your 5G maps the polygons can overlap with one another, but you can't have, a 4G at 5.1 with another 4G at 5.1, overlapping with each other. The polygons need to be sort of distinct at that point and non-overlapping. Otherwise, the system will report an error. For more details on how to model the 2 different environments and to incorporate the heat map of minimum signal strength into those files, please refer to the 3rd technical assistance webinar. I went into a deeper dive on that, and it's probably the most eloquent way that I can describe it is what I said a few days ago when we recorded that. So that's basically it. I would also encourage, and Paul's going to get into this as well, but for any of these GIS Polygon data files, checking the validity of the geometries, maybe even subdividing them into smaller pieces so that they can get processed more quickly. But those are really the issues that we've encountered for availability data for filers using the data, conforming things to the data spec. In the case of subscription data, headers, again, as I said, are optional, but they're always recommended and would probably help make sure that you're uploading the right file. The structure and content of these data files are either identical or very nearly identical to what filers may be used to filing in the Form 477 system. So hopefully that's a little bit of an easier lift for people. The exception being that the technology codes are updated for the new technology codes in the broadband data collection. So really the only practical difference, like I was saying, is that we break out the GSO and NGSO satellite and licensed and unlicensed or licensed by rural terrestrial fixed wireless into those different technology codes. Please note that service providers can start working on either their subscription data or their availability data in whatever order they like. You do not need to start with subscription data and then move on to availability data. You can start working on one, move to the other one, etc. But of course, both do need to be completed before you can complete your submission. Lastly, in the case of supporting data, that is once you've started to upload your availability data and you have some valid availability data in the system, then the supporting data tab becomes available in the BDC. For all of the files that are required under the supporting data section, they all have headers that are required. There's a bunch of different files. They all kind of correspond to different technologies with different requirements. So I'm not going to go into tons of detail about those. There's some very specific requirements for data types in those different files, but please reference the data specification for those. Again, as I said, you can start working on the supporting data for a technology as soon as you have uploaded valid availability data for that technology in the BDC system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul, who has been actually doing all of the hard work here to tell us a little bit more about the errors in the system.
Great, thanks, John. So just taking a step back at a high level, the submission overview page is essentially your home page. So it basically gives you a summary of the steps that you need to complete and the status of those steps. And of course, your objective is to get to certification. So once you upload all your data, subscription availability, supporting data, you run these final data checks, you're able to certify in the system. So we've done our best to include both visual and text cues. So if you see a green color or a checkbox, that usually means that you've got a valid file or you've completed a step in the data submission process. If you've got a red color or a red X, that indicates a hard stop, some sort of issue with your file that you're going to need to rectify before you can continue to certification. And then we've got yellow, which is a hazard, basically a warning. It's not a hard stop necessarily, but we're just giving you a warning about something in your data that it's not going to stop you from certifying, but we want to let you know about it. We've done our best to kind of give you a description of errors that are returned when you upload your file. So the availability, subscription, supporting data. If you upload data that's got some sort of validation issue with it, we'll give you the file name, the row number, the validation that failed. So you should have enough information to review your file, make necessary updates, and proceed to re-upload the data. We certainly encourage you to review the data specifications in detail. You might find yourself uploading data into the system and getting these errors. We've literally coded up each one of them. So if you don't follow them, the system will let you know that. And again, you won't be able to proceed to certification in that case. So the availability page, it's perhaps the most complex page in the application. So as a user, you're able to upload multiple files, and those files are queued up for processing, and they're processed sequentially. We can't actually process those in parallel because if you upload mobile broadband data, for example, the polygons in one file can't intersect the polygons in another file, and we can't check those unless they're processed sequentially. So you'll notice that if you upload multiple files, there will be always one in process, and then others will be queued for processing. We're performing many validation checks in the back end. Those are both performed within each file that you've uploaded and across files, just like in my example of the intersecting polygons. If you split your data into 10 pieces, we're going to check for intersecting polygons across all of the files. And again, we're doing a lot of validation checking, and that's kind of why in some cases you could see that the processing takes a little while. We're working with, in some cases, some pretty complex geospatial data. We're doing intersections. We're looking for certain thresholds. We're looking for duplicates in the data. So there's a lot of error checking and quality control that we're doing within the BDC that kind of increases the processing time in some cases. There's no silver bullet that kind of tells us how long your file will take to process. It really depends on the size of the file, the complexity of geometries within your file, the geographic extent of your data. So a lot of factors come into play. You could upload a file that's small in size, but could process for a while because we do a broadband fabric intersection in the back end so that we can give you a summary of location counts by technology in the BDC. So there's things going on behind the scenes that, again, we're doing data quality and summarization of data that could take a while in some cases. Again, I talked about a large kind of mobile broadband footprint, many vertices. We definitely encourage you to break your file into smaller pieces. If any of you have worked with GIS data, processed GIS data, you know that performing these intersections and things with massive geometries, large data sets, causes some processing time to have to run by to get to completion. So we definitely encourage you to break your data into smaller pieces. And the other benefit there is if you break your data into smaller pieces and you queue up 10 files, you'll see progress. You'll see file number 1's completed. It's on to file 2. File 2's completed. We're moving on to file 3. If you upload one big file, it could run for a while, and you might wonder what's the status of the processing. You don't really have any indication of what the status is. So if you break your file into smaller pieces, you'll see some incremental progress in the processing itself. For the fixed CSV files, we found that breaking your data into chunks of 10 or 15 million records seems to work best in the system. So again, along the lines of breaking your files into multiple pieces, smaller parts, fixed CSVs, limiting it to 10 to 15 million has been a pretty good rule of thumb. And as you upload your data, we summarize feature counts, we summarize location counts within the submission overview page. So we strongly encourage you, after you upload your data and get a valid status in the system, that you double check to make sure that the counts reflected in the system match what you expected the count to be when you uploaded the file. So we have a couple of statuses that could appear in your processing. The first one's sort of really infrequent. If you upload a very massive GIS file, you could see a timeout error or a timeout flag set in the system. And that's basically, you've uploaded such a large file that it's been processing for a long time. It likely could still be processing, but it gives you the opportunity to kind of back out of the processing of the file and to break it into smaller pieces. Currently, a file that's in processing cannot be killed or deleted. You've got to wait for that processing to run to completion. This timeout feature is one way that we built into the system to kind of give an exit to a large file that may be processing for a very long time, and the user might want to break it into smaller pieces. In rare circumstances, you might encounter a system error. In this case, what you should do is delete the file and try again. I mean, that's sort of the rule of thumb, is if it didn't work the first time, maybe give it a quick try again to see if it works. If that doesn't work, please open the file and double check it, make sure it meets the data spec. There's no sort of faulty carriage returns and sort of obscure issue with the file. We've done our best to catch all of the issues within files, but obviously there could be things that are missed. So, come across a system error, try it again, check your file. If that doesn't work, if all else fails, then please do reach out to the FCC, create a help ticket, and we've got the ability to kind of take your data, upload it into the system, and take a look at what might be causing the issue. So we certainly encourage users to use the help services, create a help ticket if there's any questions or issues that you're experiencing as part of your data submission. So that's it for me.
Great. Thanks, John, and thanks, Paul. Really appreciate it. So as a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or you can email bdcwebinar@fcc.gov with your questions. We're going to start with a few that we received early on, and then we're going to move on to ones that were submitted more recently. So, John, let me start with a question for you. How can I add a new user from my company or entity to access the BDC system?
Thanks, Sean. So this one is actually pretty easy, though it's handled sort of outside of the BDC system for the most part. So users who need access to the BDC on behalf of an entity first need to create a username and password in the FCC's commission registration system, CORS, as it's called. We can probably put the URL in the chat, but basically there's a website for you to register. You can manage FRNs there as well. So you first need an account to be able to log in there using your email address. And then the entity, the individual who's responsible for that entity, for that FRN, for managing the entity's FRN, should then go into CORS themselves and associate that new user with the FRN. So you need to be associated with one of these entity FRNs for them, for that new user to be able to access the system. The new user can then go into the BDC system at bdc.fcc.gov, log in with the username that they registered in CORS, username and password that they registered in CORS. And then they'll be able to see the FRN for the entity that is in CORS and be able to log in and take action on behalf of that entity. But they first need to register the account and be associated with that FRN in CORS.
Thanks, John. Another question for you. Do my data need to include header rows?
Yes, by and large, Yes, every single file, CSV file should have headers. The only exception being for your subscription data where headers are optional, but as always are recommended to be consistent and help avoid any issues. We made those optional primarily because the headers are not required in the FCC's Form 477 system. So to make it easier for filers, we allowed that to go there. But otherwise, the header rows must match the rows that are provided in the data specifications. Please make sure that those align.
Great. Paul, a question for you. I think you covered this in your presentation, but just to circle back to it, does subscription data need to be entered before availability data, or can you enter availability data prior to uploading subscription data?
No, so the order of subscription availability does not matter. So you could start one or the other. There are dependencies though. So you can't start supporting data until you upload availability data and receive at least one valid status on the availability page. And kind of similarly, you can't run your final data checks until both subscription availability and supporting data have been completed. And then you can't certify until all 4 steps have been completed. So in terms of subscription availability, the order there doesn't matter, but there are dependencies in other parts of the workflow.
Thanks, Paul. John, another question for you. The file I uploaded is taking a long time to process. I see a processing message. Is this normal?
Yes. So I think as Paul was alluding to, the GIS files that you create that represent service area can be very large and complex, especially if they're based upon propagation modeling for mobile and fixed wireless, and have a large number of vertices and have very complex geometries, cover wide geographic areas. These files can often take a significant amount of time to process, could be some number of hours. And as the system is performing all of these validations, like Paul was mentioning, the subdivision of the data in smaller pieces and checking for errors and overlays, making sure that you're not overlapping, among other tasks. So it's really pretty normal for a file that contains a large geographic footprint to take multiple hours to process. And the system will alert you during this time frame if there's any hard stop errors, and will stop processing at that point if there's errors found in a particular file. So again, we encourage people to start early. Again, there's other things you can do, like checking your file for geometry errors, and maybe even subdividing it into smaller number of polygons, like maybe fewer than 10,000 vertices for these polygons. Those will help speed things up because these are processes that the system will have to do, and also it's a lot easier to work with the smaller geometries at that level.
Thanks, John. Another question for you. I need to upload a large number of locations for my availability data. Should I put all of the records in one file or divide them into smaller files?
Yeah, so as Paul was alluding to earlier, if you need to upload a large number of locations for your fixed availability data in a CSV file, that has more than, 10, 15, 20 million records, we would encourage dividing the file into or the data into multiple files so that you have 10 million, 15 million per file, and then zip the CSV file, each of the CSV files, zip those into a zip archive, which should make the file a lot smaller and upload a lot quicker, so that it'll smooth the processing of your data files. Similarly, for mobile or for fixed coverage map data, if you have a large number of areas or large coverage footprint, you can again cut that into smaller pieces, maybe by market or state. Anything that kind of breaks it into smaller pieces will help the system process it a little bit faster, and as Paul was saying earlier, give you a little bit more real-time feedback on where the system is in the processing of your file.
Great. Let's see. Okay, another one for you, John. My company has entered its coverage shape files, and we have downloaded the underlying location data. I'm not seeing any indicator that a location is unserved, and I had expected to see that. Is that something that's not yet there? Does the location data return depend in any way on what technology code my company used? Do you have any guidance on what people should expect to see when they upload shape files in the system?
Yeah, so if you upload a fixed broadband coverage map shapefile GIS data into the system, there is a feature in the system to allow for you to download your raw data. You can download what you uploaded, but you can also download sort of the processed fabric points, basically the fabric points that were overlapping with your coverage footprint, so that you can see actually, once the GIS data for fixed data is submitted in the system, we largely work with the actual underlying points, the fabric points. So, it's what you're downloading. If you download that file, it's really a simple playback of the data that you submitted. So if you didn't report service to a broadband serviceable location because it didn't overlap with your Polygon, then it's not going to show up in the playback of your data, even if the BSL is actually included in the fabric data file that you may have gotten from CostQuest. So any areas that don't overlap, you're not going to see in there. Those would be the ones that are unserved because you've reported your coverage service area and it didn't overlap with that underlying point. So there's no determination that's made about whether a location might be considered served or unserved in the underlying, by the FCC or other agencies. So, if you've uploaded that Polygon, the assumption is that anything underneath that Polygon, anything that's covered by, any location covered by that Polygon is a location, a fabric location that you can or do serve. So, we really just do this intersection, overlaying the coverage maps with the coverage map Polygon with the locations underneath it, and that's what you get when you download that processed, what is it, fabric location fabric data. Anyway, whatever it is in the system, not the raw data. It's really that intersection between your uploaded polygons and the underlying fabric.
Thanks, John. Let's see. Gonna walk out on a limb and try and answer one or two myself. Let's see, and people can keep me honest, so that the real subject matter experts can help keep me honest. So let's see, we received a question. Will service providers be able to submit data on September 1st, or will the filing window close on August 31st? If it's on the 1st, what time will the filing window close? So the answer here is that under the rules, data as of June 30th is due on or before September 1st. So September 1st is the filing deadline up until, I believe, 11:59 p.m. local time, though hopefully no one is waiting until that point in time for all the reasons that John and Paul have discussed. That said, the system is not going to shut down on 11:59 p.m. local time on the 1st. The system will remain open and files can continue to be uploaded. But that technical capability is a separate and distinct issue from compliance with the rules. So hopefully that answers the question. Another question. Hello. I noted on the secondary addresses file that there is not a BSL field. Would they all be BSLs or broadband serviceable locations? So each of the fabric IDs that is in the secondary address file is part of the main fabric file. So once you identify the unique location ID, you'll still want to confirm that the BSL flag field is marked as true in the main file before submitting it into the system as part of your availability data filing, if you're doing a location list. John, back to you. If subscription data for the Form 477 or the BDC contains a subscriber at a non-BSL location, should that subscriber data be removed from the 477 and the BDC subscription data files? Yeah, so to be clear, and I know this can be a little confusing, it's probably a little confusing to me when I was first working on this, the Form 477 and the BDC, including the BDC's collection of the subscriber data, are kind of separate. They're related collections, but they aren't really separate.
And both must be filed, at least for now, according to the rules and instructions that are relevant. So the Form 477 application hasn't changed since the last round. So no surprises there. It's really whatever you are going to, whatever the rules are and whatever you reported before, you should be reporting, updated for any changes in your underlying data in the Form 477 today. So for BDC availability, if you can or do provide service to a location that is not a broadband serviceable location in the Fabric data, then you will not be able to list that location as having service available, assuming that you're filing a list of locations. If you're filing your coverage data, again, it'll be doing that intersection with the underlying Fabric data, and anything that is not BSL of true, BSL flag of true, is not going to show up in that intersection. We recognize that there may be issues that people have with the underlying Fabric that they want to file challenges to correct that. That process, stay tuned. There's a lot more information that'll be coming out about that, and I'm sure people are itching to do that. But the it's sort of not in use for the purpose of the initial filing here, where we're really looking at the baseline of what the current Fabric says. So for then the subscription, so you shouldn't report something that is not, BSL flag if you're doing that location list, because it's not going to show up. It's going to be rejected in the system. For the subscription data in the BDC, you should include in your subscription, include the subscription in your tracked level data for the subscription tabulations. And assuming that the data are tabulated correctly, you should be able to clear the final data checks. Basically, there could be situations where a particular location falls in a census tract, and it's it's the only area that you serve, only location that you serve, and it's not a BSL. If you run into any of those issues, obviously please reach out to us. We can certainly help walk people through what they should do. But typically you should report for that tract, any of the subscriptions that you have based upon the subscriptions that you offer in that area.
Thanks, John. Another one for you. If you are the licensee of Spectrum, but the Spectrum has been leased to another broadband provider, do you have to file in the BDC, or does the lessee file as part of their availability filing?
Yeah, so the requirements for the BDC are similar actually to what we had, I think, for 4477 as well. So it's facilities-based providers of mobile broadband service must submit their availability data in the BDC. However, if you don't make your service available, mass market broadband internet access service available, instead you own the, you have a license for the Spectrum, and you've leased it out to people, but you don't actually provide any service, then you typically would not be reporting that as your coverage. However, the party that leased your Spectrum, that has that is doing the management and build out of a network using your leased Spectrum, that downstream provider must file in both the BDC and in the 4477 system, because they're the ones who are actually providing the service. So in other words, the downstream provider, the person who's leasing the Spectrum, they are the facilities-based provider, even if they don't have even if they don't have the original license with the FCC for the Spectrum. If they're just leasing it from somebody, they still need to report that that's what they're providing, because they're the ones providing the service.
Thanks, John. Okay, I'm going to try and answer a few more questions. We received one. I'm a fixed wireless entity. My advertised maximum download and upload is 100 over 20 megabits per second, but service levels vary slightly. Should I report the max down and max up that is advertised? Yes, please enter the maximum advertised upload and download speeds, not actual throughput speeds. So if the speeds are advertised as up to 100 megabits per second downlink, then that should be reported as 100 megabits per second. But please note that you do need to be able to make that service available. So it's not sufficient that you simply, advertise it. You have to be able to add a particular location, either you're currently providing service or you're capable of performing a standard broadband installation, which is defined in our rules and prior orders as, I believe, initiation of service within 10 business days and no special costs, special construction costs to the end user. Let's see, I'm a brand new service provider, and when I entered my data, I got an error flag questioning my proposed coverage area. What does that mean? So I think it likely means that since you haven't filed in 477 previously, you're getting a yellow flag, just kind of indicating that we don't have prior deployment data from Form 477 on file for you. But John can correct me if I've misstated that. Is that accurate, John?
That is correct. We do. There are edit checks to see, you know, if you are sort of a known party before, and if you are new, that's fine. We allow new entrants. We allow people who have built out new service. But there may be, you know, there are some additional checks in there to make sure that, you know, somebody who, you know, basically it's a way for us to confirm that you are in fact the facilities-based provider, and you know, make sure that you are in fact able to provide that service. Sometimes we've had people in the past who, for whatever reason, didn't understand the filing requirements and suddenly started filing stuff when they actually don't provide the service, or they don't provide a mass market service. And so it's basically a way for us to double check, and for you all to double check and make sure that this is actually the right thing that you're supposed to be filing.
Thanks, John. And I think the only other reminder there is just that you are reporting availability as of June 30th. It is a snapshot in time. So make sure that when you upload your data, you are only showing service that was available as of June 30th. You know, so if you were, you know, working furiously to build out and expand network deployment, you would not include locations that were turned up on July 4th or July 10th or, you know, August 1st. So just be mindful of that. Let's see, a question about will the narrative that was being discussed a short while ago in terms of format and specific column value requirements, will that be documented? I believe it's in the data specification documentation that's currently available on the website. In addition, I would just note that this webinar, like the prior webinars, the recording will be posted online. So if you do want to kind of go back and re-listen to the description to the extent it was really helpful, and I'm sure it was, it was a good breakdown, you can access it on the website. But I think the data specification documentation will also be helpful.
And Sean, I would add to that as well that I believe we have, and you probably would know more than I do, but I believe we have a bunch of Help Center articles around a lot of these topics. Actually, I'm not making this up, and I'm cribbing from a lot of material that we've pulled together before, and responses that we've given to people. So we do have frequently asked questions, and we can certainly add to that to the extent that something was covered here that wasn't already on there. But there are a lot of these that are already out there. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to take a look at the frequently asked questions on the Help Center as well.
Very good plug, John. Absolutely. So Paul, a question for you, and maybe you and John, but is there a file size that you consider to be so large that it does potentially run the risk of hanging up in the system?
Yeah, I guess kind of back to my previous point, there's no silver bullet when it comes to, I guess, file size that I can kind of quote here. That the smaller size, the better. Within reason, obviously, we don't want you breaking it into tiny little chunks, but you know, once you start getting into the gigs, it takes a while. You're processing a single data set, and again, we're doing all these validations and looking for overlaps and things. So, you know, I think hundreds of megs, if you could keep it to that would be a good thing. And again, I think one of the perks of breaking into pieces is you can see the status of, you know, multiple files. You know, 1 of 10 is done, 2 of 10 is done, as opposed to uploading one large file. And you're kind of wondering, is it still running? Why is it taking so long? I do want to kind of talk about that point for another second. If a file is in process and it's been processing for a while, the only time you should really worry is if you see a timeout error. That means that something could be faulty. But if it says processing, it's very likely that it's processing and it's just taking a while because of all the validations that we're doing. John, anything to add there?
No, I mean, with the fixed broadband location list CSV data, again, breaking it into 10 million, 15 million chunks probably is best. Those actually should probably process pretty quickly or relatively quickly. With the mobile broadband in particular, like if you're a nationwide mobile broadband provider, those can take longer. So, I think we have generally been recommending to some of the larger providers to maybe split them into, 8, 10, 15, chunks across different parts of the country by region or state. And, one of the things that you may encounter, and again, going back to the GIS processing, but if you are uploading GIS data and you know that you have some particularly complex polygons, which may be the case in, if you've done the mobile data and you have the heat map and you've dissolved it away to make sure there's no overlaps between your polygons, you may want to then run a tool like I think in ArcGIS it's called Dice, in QGIS it's called Subdivide. There could be other tools, but basically to cap the number of points or vertices in your polygons to make them a little bit smaller and easier to digest. The system will do this for you automatically when there's more than 10,000 vertices in a polygon. But that process takes time. And so, and in the meantime, before it's diced and subdivided, it's actually very, very difficult and computationally complex for the system to do any kind of processing with it. So you may find that if your files are taking 6, 8, 10 hours to process, break them into smaller pieces, run one of these subdivides, and then make sure that the geometries are repaired. Doing all of that will clean up your data and make it really easier for the system to handle, and it'll speed up the processing considerably.
Great, thanks to you both. John, a question for you. What are the title headers for fixed broadband deployment data? Is it the same from the template document?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked at the template, but I'm pretty sure the templates are based upon what we are expecting. Off the top of my head, I think it's provider _ID, location _ID, brand name, max advertised the download speed, max advertised upload speed, low latency, business residential code. Anyway, I probably got the order of those wrong, but it's in the data spec. It's in the sample data file. The field names are there, and they must match. And the system will give you an error right away if the headers don't match. So it should be pretty self-explanatory. But yeah, the template that's there will give you a good starting point. And if you wanted to start filling things in there, that's what we're looking for.
Thanks, John. I'll try and take the next question. Can we show an example of supporting information required for fixed broadband availability filings? I don't think we can provide a visual today just because it's going to depend on the type of availability data that you submit. So if you can submit obviously your availability data as a fixed wireless polygon, as a fixed wireless provider submitting a list of locations, or another type of technology for fixed service. If you are a fixed wireless service provider and you're uploading a polygon, we include a CSV example or sample for each of the supporting data within the help article that we published on our website for fixed wireless broadband supporting data. So we might be able to drop a link to that in the chat, but if not, you can go to fcc.gov/broadband data/help. And in the search bar, you can just search for fixed wireless broadband supporting data, and that should bring you to the knowledge base article that I'm referencing there. For all other fixed service technologies and for fixed wireless providers that file using a list of locations, the supporting data is a web form with 3 questions regarding the methodology used to collect the availability data. So we don't really have a visualization of that, but we may be able to provide something in the future to the extent it would be helpful. Let's see, John, I'm going to try and give this next question to you. Are there additional questions that come up after uploading location files? We uploaded our voice subscription data, and we're then presented with additional questions about the number of interconnected VoIP subscriptions and local exchange telephone subscriptions that we were not expecting. What other questions might come up after subscription and availability files are uploaded?
Yeah, so there's a number of questions that that come up when you're running your final data checks. So with regards to the voice data and how to allocate the numbers for each state, this can be found in the Form 477 resources. I believe we also have a Help Center knowledge base article about how to report and allocate the number of subscribers for each state. So I'd recommend that users, filers, reference the user guide for clarity of an example, the Form 477 resources page, as well as the BDC Help Center pages that refer to this can be helpful, and the links at the bottom of the BDC Help site include the Form 477 resources. The supporting data required for fixed broadband availability is dependent on the technology and how the availability is being submitted. Each of these have their own supporting data articles on the BDC Help site, which will probably describe what you're looking for. But yeah, you're right. During the final data checks in particular, there are a bunch of checks that compare with your voice and other subscription data to your availability data. And of course, when you're completing and uploading your data for subscription data, there's a lot of specifics about how to allocate and what the different subscriber values mean in comparison. And we do compare that at the end in the final data checks against the availability data to make sure there's nothing that's particularly inconsistent.
Great. Thanks, John. Let's see. Another question for you. I'm working on being able to submit availability data. Is there somewhere I can look at what supporting data will be required prior to that tab being open for me in the submission portal?
Yeah. So I think we posted in the chat for the fixed broadband supporting data. There's also a Help Center page for mobile broadband supporting data, which I'll see if I can pull up and put in the chat as well. But basically, the different files that are required depend on the technology. So in the case of mobile, effectively all of the supporting data files are required for each technology, including for the voice service. For the fixed broadband, it really is dependent upon the technology and the format of the data. So if you give us the fixed broadband data in CSV format and the fixed broadband location list data format, there's a lot fewer questions that you have to answer and information that you have to give us when you're submitting, for example, fixed wireless service. Whereas if you give us a Polygon, a propagation map of your fixed wireless service, we need to know a bunch of details about how you actually generated that, including aspects of the link budget and the propagation model and clutter and things like that. So that depends on if you're uploading GIS or CSV data, but all of those should be in the supporting data pages, as well as the data spec, which I think lists out for each technology and each type of service what is required.
Thanks, John. So I see we only have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try and do lightning round on a couple of questions, but I would encourage Paul and John to take a look while I'm going through some of these, and if they see questions that they think I've skipped over that we should try and get to before the top of the hour, please. I'll give you an opportunity after I touch on a couple of these. I also want to note I'm seeing quite a few kind of filer specific questions, like I'm getting this error in the system, or my data is doing this sort of thing. I realize we're not going to be able to answer all of those today, so I would very much encourage you, if you are having an issue with getting your data through validations or checks or uploaded into the system, to submit a ticket, submit a request for assistance on the Bdc Help Center. Again, that's fcc.gov/broadband data/help. You'll see a link at the top of the screen. Submit a request, and that will open a trouble ticket in the system that will get you technical assistance resources to help answer your question. But let's see, kind of hitting a couple of questions. Do entities need to file the BDC reports if they do not have customers that are voice and no off-the-shelf broadband offerings? So at this time, fixed voice-only providers and providers that offer only non-mass market services are not required to file in the BDC. That is separate and apart from any obligations you may have to file 477 data. But as of now, there's not a requirement to file in the BDC. Another question: we are a governmental agency and we provide service to community anchor institutions, so non-governmental organizations. In the BDC system, our designation is service provider. Is this correct, or shall we request a change to governmental entity? No, you are correct. If you are a service provider, then you want to be registered as a service provider in the system. So even if you're a municipal broadband provider, so you're both a governmental entity and an ISP, you want to be registered as a service provider. One other thing that we want to flag for you is that community anchor institutions are not in the fabric with the BSL flag marked as true. That is based on the commission's requirements and rules that were adopted in prior commission reports and orders. So some of those community anchor institutions may not be reportable in the fixed availability data. So just keep that in mind. And we provided some additional details on that, I believe, in a July 1st public notice where we announced the bulk fabric challenge process data specifications, and also some kind of parameters around how the commission is defining broadband serviceable locations. Circling back to a can of worms, I think I opened when talking about 11:59 p.m. on September 1st. People are asking, is that the provider's local time? Is that the DC local time? It is 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. That is, I believe, under the commission's rules. Filings have to be received by midnight on the day they are due at the commission. So we use the commission's Eastern time as the deadline. But the system will show as open until 11:59 p.m. On the I think the last time zone within the filing zone, which I believe is Hawaiian Aleutian time, but that's really more kind of a technical piece. So try and get your data in by 11:59 p.m. September 1st, Eastern Daylight Time, if possible.
Sure. Sean, a really quick one. I see a couple questions. So there's a certify step as part of the submission process. That is to be completed by the filer. So that's the filer certifying their submission. It's not, you've gone through final data checks and you're waiting for the FCC to certify your submission. So please do complete that certification step at the end. And when you do, it'll give you a badge that says certified for your submission.
Thanks, Paul.
Similarly, on certification, we have a question that, how will the final certifications work? Do certifying officials and certifying engineers need to log into the system? The certification needs to be completed by a single user in the system. Basically, the language on the certifications indicate that entering the information for that individual will constitute that individual's agreement to the certification, and then ultimately the filer that's in there will certify on behalf of those individuals after completing the information. But the party that is, the engineer or the official who's reviewing that, if that's not the filer itself, will need to review and attest to, agree to the certifications that are there.
Another one really quick is if you see a step in the workflow grayed out, there's a reason for that. It means that you have not completed a prerequisite step. If you are trying to fill in explanations for final data checks and the edit button is grayed out, it means that you have hard stop errors that you need to rectify before you can actually continue on to certification. So just to kind of summarize, if there's grayed out buttons, grayed out ability to add things, there's a reason behind it. It means that you've not completed prerequisite steps.
Great. Well, thank you both, Paul and John. I see we're just a minute or so over. Thank you all for joining this fourth and final workshop. Again, I want to put in a plug for fcc.gov/broadband data/help. That is the Bdc Help Center. You can find frequently asked questions. You can find knowledge-based articles. You can find helpful tutorial videos in addition to these videos, kind of step-by-step guidance on how to get into the system, how to register your entity information, how to upload your data. And there is that submit a request feature to get specific questions answered. Again, if we did not make it to your question today, please submit it as a ticket and we will get to it as quickly as possible in advance of the September 1st, 11:59 p.m. Eastern time filing deadline. But thank you again for taking part. Thank you to the staff and everyone on the Broadband Data Task Force for helping prep for today's session and the earlier sessions. And best of luck as you finish out your filings in this inaugural filing process. So thanks everyone and have a good rest of the day.